taking your watermelon farm and one of your farms in Florida as an example. So Florida is the first state that you farm in that comes into, ready for harvest in early spring, usually mid-spring. And the country that is finishing up, our winter melon, because when was the last time, folks, you walked into the grocery store and watermelon wasn't on shelf? It's available year round. And the only way that we can do that is to, we have to follow the sun, so you're either looking into the Southern Hemisphere, Central America, Mexico, what have you. So typically with watermelon, we use that as the example since we've got the one and only Sarah Frey here with us. So we're getting our watermelon from Mexico. Sarah's watermelons in Florida are ready to harvest and sell. And Publix in Florida, or any retailer.
This is hypothetical.
It's hypothetical. I'm painting a story. I have to call out. Everyone goes to Publix when they're in Florida. It's like one of the first places I stop when I go to the beach. I go to Publix before I go to the sand. All right. So, so the grocer, we don't have to call them out. So the grocer at their buying office, they get quotes from the farmers that have the watermelon that's available for them to purchase. What price point would the domestic, because we're paying domestic labor rates, they're going to be higher than what, the farms in Mexico are paying?
5 to 8 times higher.
Right. Because then if you're the retailer and all we care about is price or the short-term gain, who are you going to go with? And so is that a realistic example, Sarah?
So any retailer is going to look at that. Naturally, they're going to want to choose domestic product because they're going to know it's fresher, first of season. They're going to want that product in their stores, but ultimately it's going to come down to a bottom line number. And when you have overlapping seasons, there are going to be some major price gaps in between what's produced domestically and then what is imported. And fruit and vegetable farmers in the U.S. are held to standards, whether it's on labor, which I'm the first one to, I think those are good standards to be held to.
Yeah, Sarah's been in Congress talking about improving labor conditions on farms.
But that has to be applied across the board. So you can't have it's like having rules for thee and not for me, So you can't have wage rates that are instituted in the US and other countries competing that are not held to the same standards. I mean, it's no different than why our manufacturing jobs left every small town and in the heart of the country, right? This is the same thing. Is the same principle applies to what's happening to a lot of these farms. So, when you can't afford the government regulated wage rates to, say, use an H-2A worker, which is an agriculture worker, on your farm because you're competing with your competition isn't held to the same standard and your growing costs are higher and your labor costs, which in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry is a major component of your overall cost. If you're at that disadvantage, you can't stay in business. There's not a viable path for you. Because you can't start out with that competitive disadvantage in your season and ultimately sell your crop at you can't even break even at that price. So American farmers, and maybe it's just because there aren't a lot of us, I don't know. I mean, farmers are such a small percentage of the population. And I sit here and I think, yeah, but we're feeding the world. Doesn't anybody care? Maybe it's because there are so few of us that no one really, dialed the lens in and put the microscope down on that to say, oh, okay. And, that's usually how problems sort of evolve over time. And then, you have, one farm shuts down, then another farm shuts down, and then maybe a packing facility that's packing tomatoes and immokalee in the late 90s, early 2000s, it shuts down. And then you have a big, vacant building in the middle of a rural town that used to be vibrant with the packing of fresh produce. But because, of the way that we conduct trade in this country, they like quietly shut down operations. And then you wake up one day and you say, where did it all go? We're at that point, I guess, is my point in bringing up the fact that over half of our fruits and vegetables are imported. We've hit that mark. Okay. We're at that point where we're looking around, and now you can clearly see the impacts of what has transpired through, rules, regulations, laws, trade agreements, what has transpired over the past 30 years. And if we don't recognize that now and come to terms with it and start to try to turn the ship back around, and we're going to be looking at a number of 75%, 80% in 4 years from now. And then at what point is that, at what point does that even, cease to exist in our country? And that's why I think it's critical too. And I think we have to take a really good look at where we have diversity and geographic diversity in growing our fruits and vegetables. So you think about the production in California and what they constantly have struggled with. I don't feel like their environmental problems are going to get any easier to solve in California. So that's going to push more of the production either out of the country, out of the US, and a lot of it, frankly, a lot of the reason that we have such a high import number is that those farmers have already made investments in Mexico, and they're already doing a lot. They've shifted a lot of that production over the border. But then you have to look at the resources that you have in, land and growing regions. And this is where I think there's an opportunity really for these small farms in the Midwest. They might even be larger grain farms that have, 1,000, 2,000 acres, 3,000 acres, or even 5,000 acres of row crops, but they have maybe 100 acres set aside for diversity in their business, where they're growing a specialty type crop, and there's a lot of that going on. But I think that we have to take a lot of things into consideration. And I tell you that we also have challenges with the uncertainty of the weather patterns now, and whether you believe climate change is real or not, or how much of it's man-made versus how much of it's natural. I'm not here to debate that, but I can tell you that growing seasons and have changed, and some are longer, some are hotter, some are shorter. Weather events, natural disasters seem to be happening more frequently, which impact the amount of production that we have. So I think these are all things that we need to take into account, and it all ties back to ultimately food security is national security. We have to change course. We cannot continue to import over half of the fruits and vegetables that we eat. And we have to take a long, hard look at the resources that we have in our country and identify the places in America in which we can diversify and make investments into sustainable agriculture and grow more of the food that we need to support a growing population.